All right, everybody. So this is the video to do the second half of the chapter 6 lecture. So as you recall, chapter 6 takes us from 1776 to 1789, 1776 being the year that the Declaration of Independence was signed, sealed, delivered to the king, rejected by the king, and the king essentially decided that he was going to react in a very violent way. And so he didn't just say, okay, well, it's been a good run. You guys go ahead and have your freedom. That's fine. He's going to kind of violently, aggressively try to force the colonists to stay. And again, going back to the analogy of the relationship, it's a bad look for the king as the colonists try to gain their independence. We talked about all that already. We talked about how the war went from 1776 to 1783. The fighting really ended in 1781, and then a couple of years of negotiation. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed between the brand new United States of America and Great Britain. That made it official. It's kind of the signing of the divorce papers where everything becomes legal. And the United States of America is a brand new little baby country in 1783. We talked about how the war itself from 1776 to 1783 kind of can be broken down into two parts, really kind of before the French show up and after the French show up. So before the French show up, George Washington very wisely realizes that the colonists have no chance of actually winning this war, right? It's the whole De La Salle varsity football versus Bristol's freshman goofballs, right? There's no chance of actually winning this war. We don't have a full we don't have a government. We barely have a military that's just started recruiting. We don't have a national economic system. Each colony kind of has its own economy going on. Each colony has its own militia, own way of funding all that. The whole thing is disorganized and it's a hot mess. And meanwhile, we're going up against Great Britain, which is, one of the preeminent nations in the world, strongest army, strongest navy, already 10,000 troops stationed in the United States. So anyway, point being, we already went over all that George Washington recognized we have no chance of actually winning this war, so we just have to try to drag it out, make it turn into a war of attrition, try to outlast them, hope that they either wear themselves out and give up because it's taking too long and taking too many resources, or at least drag it out to convince a European country to get involved. And that's exactly what we did. So we basically played hide and seek, turned it into a war of attrition, tried to drag it out as long as we could. And then finally, after a year, our diplomats, led by Thomas Jefferson, convinced the French to get involved. And really, the only thing that convinced them to get involved was the fact that everyone expected that we'd be crushed in the first month or so. We drew it out for a year, and finally won a major battle at Saratoga, just north of Albany in New York. So those two things, dragging it out and winning a major battle, convinced the French to get involved. Once the French have gotten involved, um, the course of the war is going to turn. Not overnight. It's going to take 3 years for us to finally get them to wave the white flag. But between 1788, the spring of 1788, when the French arrive, and 1781, we could fight a legitimate war. We have a navy, we have an army, we have funding. All that stuff is coming from the French, and that allows us to turn the tide of the war to eventually become victorious. Again, 1781 at Yorktown. 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed, and the United States of America is now a brand new country. But here's the problem. We don't know what happens next. No one has a plan for that, or at least there isn't a mutually agreed upon plan for that, right? That's the problem. So when we were fighting a war, remember, 13 colonies just barely decided that they could tolerate each other just enough to come together and unify to fight against Great Britain in order to earn our independence. So that was not, it wasn't 13 best friends all singing Kumbaya, marching together to the same drum. Everybody agrees on what they're doing. This was, again, a very, very fragile coalition of the 13 colonies, which will become the 13 states, that really only existed because they had a common purpose, and that common purpose was defeating the British. Well, now we've done that. The British have gone. The British have hopped on their boats and they've sailed back across the ocean. And now it's us, right? Now what? Now that very loose coalition doesn't have a common purpose other than do we form a government together? So one of the things about this time period and about this lecture and this chapter that I think is really important is it helps us, again, realize that any assumption that we have about inevitability in history is misguided, right? We can't assume that everything was inevitable. We can't just assume, and I think we often do because of lazy thinking, myself included, that we fought the Revolutionary War, we won, and when we won, of course, the 13 colonies all just gave each other a big group hug and became the United States of America, and it was easy, right? That's the farthest thing from the truth. It was a very fragile moment, fraught with conflict. And there's many moments throughout the beginning, right after the war's over, and at the very beginning, the creation of the United States, a lot of moments, frequently, where the whole thing nearly falls apart. I can imagine a lot of different ways the thing could have turned out rather than the 13 colonies all deciding to become the United States of America. We could have divided into 3 different countries, right? Because we really have 3 fundamentally different societies with New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. They're very different from one another. So we could have had 3 different countries. We could have had, 7 different countries. Maybe Virginia wants to be its own country. Maybe Carolinas want to come together and form a country. New England, whatever. A lot of different things could happen. Maybe we made an attempt at making this happen. And because we can't agree on stuff, there's a lot of infighting, and a civil war breaks out within the first 10 years of our country existing. And maybe the southern states, which weren't really that mad at Britain to begin with compared to New England, decide, hey, you know what? We'll go back to Great Britain. And the southern states go back to Great Britain. And now we just have New England and the middle states that are part of the United. I mean, there's so many different. Great Britain could have waited for us to have internal conflict that destabilized us and then invaded us again and taken us back over. I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios that could have happened, right? So there's nothing inevitable about what happened. And in fact, it was fraught with conflict, and it was very, very fragile. It was a very fragile moment for our nation because we're a baby. We are a brand new baby. We don't even have muscles on our neck. We can't even hold our neck up ourselves, right? We are a brand new baby country. And again, there wasn't a blueprint. There wasn't a game plan. All we knew in 1776 was that we wanted to get rid of Great Britain. And the only way for us to be able to do that was to work together. That's all we knew. Once we accomplished that goal, now what, right? So again, going back to, I'm popping back and forth between all these different analogies, but let's go back to the breakup analogy, right? So you've decided you want to break up with this person, you have packed up all your stuff, you have, filed the divorce, but whatever you want to do, you got everything you need to do to break up with this person, and you move out, and now you got the U-Haul truck filled, and you're in the driver's seat, and you're about to drive away, and then you realize, wait a minute, I don't know what I'm doing now. I didn't go find a new apartment to move into. I haven't called any of my friends to see if I can sleep on the couch for a while. I haven't called my mom and dad to see if I can move back in with them for a little while I get on my feet. All I've done is moved out. And now I'm I don't know, I don't have any plans. So now I got to figure it out right now. Right. So that's really where we're at. It's a very, again, fragile and fraught moment. So parts 3 and 4 are going to kind of trace how we get through all of that, right? How we kind of try to figure it all out. So the first thing that happens is that all of the states are gonna everybody's gonna kind of go back to their home state, right? Everybody's gonna kind of just retreat back to their home state because that's what they feel loyal to. There's no loyalty to the United States of America. It's really not until the 18 teens and 1820s where people even start calling themselves Americans. George Washington, the first president of the United States, called himself a Virginian, and he said his country was Virginia. So that's kind of the way that people still think about this thing. So first thing is going to happen is everybody's going to kind of go back to their home states. Cool, we got rid of the British. What happens now? Everybody's like, well, all of our states had governments that existed based on Great Britain allowing us to exist. So first things first, we all got to go back and kind of rewrite our constitutions in our home states. So we are not in this class going to go through all 13 states and learn about what each state did in their own constitution. But we are going to focus on 2 states, and there's a couple reasons why. We're going to focus on Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. And mostly that's just to illustrate the larger point that 13 different states are going to come up with 13 unique different ideas of how they want to have government in their state. And that's fine, right? Because what I do in my house has nothing to do with what my neighbors do in their house, right? That doesn't impact each other. As long as I'm in my house doing my thing, in their house they're doing their thing. So that's kind of true with the colonies too. Whatever Georgia wants to do in Georgia doesn't affect New Hampshire, and whatever Rhode Island wants to do doesn't affect Maryland, right? But the problem is going to be once they all come back together and say, okay, what should a national government look like? if we're going to have a national government, if there's going to be a United States of America, there's going to be one government for all of us. Each state is going to bring an idea that is based on what they had with their own state. So as long as every state has their own thing going on, that's fine. But if Pennsylvania shows up to the national government and it's like, this is what I think it should look like, and Massachusetts shows up to the national, whatever the convention is where they're creating national government, they say, well, we think this is what it should look like, and those two things don't look the same, we're going to have a problem, right? And it's not just those two states, it's 11 other states also. So again, we are very fragile. There's no reason to assume that this whole thing should work out easily. And right from the jump, we're going to have very different ideas about what government should look like. And in a broader sense, what's happening here is that everybody agreed in 1776. Actually, first of all, not everybody did agree. Remember, only 33% of the colonists wanted to declare their independence. But let's just talk about those people. Everybody agreed that they wanted liberty and they wanted freedom, and they were tired of the tyranny from the British, and that the natural rights of men that they have been talking about during this whole Enlightenment era, and that they've been that they kind of grew up on as colonists, learning about the Enlightenment. These natural rights of men demand freedom and demand liberty. So everybody agreed that freedom and liberty and natural rights and an opposition to tyranny was important, right? Everybody was on board with that. But then once Great Britain's gone, and once we become a country, and we're going to become a country which is founded on the ideas of liberty and freedom and natural rights, and an opposition to tyranny, the reality is once you start asking everybody to define what that actually means, what does that actually look like in real life, everybody's going to start having a very different idea, or everybody's going to express different, look, this is what liberty means to me, this is what liberty means to me, this is what freedom means to me, this is what freedom means to me, this is what natural rights means to me, this is what natural rights means to me. And all of a sudden we're going to start realizing, well, there's millions of people in these 13 different colonies, a lot of whom have very different ideas of what freedom and liberty and so on so mean, right? So that's going to start to be where things get messy. And we can't really afford messiness right now, again, because everything is incredibly fragile. So let's dive into it. All right. So part 3, creating Republican institutions. I'm actually going to take my hat off. Okay. So as I mentioned a moment ago, let's take a look at a couple of the state constitutions, right? We have Pennsylvania and we have Massachusetts. It doesn't say Massachusetts, but it says John Adams, and that's basically synonymous. So we have Pennsylvania on one side and we have Massachusetts on the other side, okay? So again, and there's 11 others, but we're just focusing on these two. So let's look at how different Pennsylvania's new state government is. This is how they established their own state government versus Massachusetts. So in Pennsylvania, things are very simple. Things are very democratic. Things are very, how do I want to say, they've created a system that they feel that allows for as much direct democracy as is possible, right? So this is how they set up their government. It's a unicameral legislature. That a legislature is basically a representative government where everybody votes for their representatives, and then those representatives go and vote, right? And unicameral means it's one house instead of two houses. So today, our Congress, the United States of America, has two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Pennsylvania Constitution created a unicameral legislature. That just means that everybody has someone that represents them in government, and there's only one house. There's not two different houses, right? So let's put that in the context of what something that we might be familiar with. So let's say that, we were in school, we're in regular times, everybody's in school, and then there was an announcement of the loudspeaker where like the principal said, hey, guess what? We just finally realized that California High School is a stupid name for a high school in California, so we're going to change the name of our high school. We have two different options. What we need is for every classroom to weigh in on this. So you guys figure out which option you like, option A or option B, and then everybody send one representative down to the quad, and then we will have a vote. So every classroom will have one vote representing the 35 people in that classroom, and they'll go down and they'll cast their vote, and whichever one wins, that's the new name of the high school. It's very simple, and is, again, very democratic. It's the closest thing you can get to direct democracy other than just having everybody vote, right? Direct democracy would just be like everybody in the school vote, say what you think. So it's still representative democracy, but it's a very short distance from common everyday Pennsylvanian to person making the decisions, right? It's one step, it's a short distance, it's not complicated, it's simple, right? And the other thing that Pennsylvania included, which is very democratic for the standards of the time, maybe not for our standards today, but for the standards of the time, was um, they allowed any white man who paid taxes to vote. Right? Again, not democratic by our standards today, but any white man who paid taxes can vote. You didn't have to own land. You didn't have to have a certain amount of money. So that was probably the most allowed for the most number of voters compared to any other state, because a lot of the other states were like, oh, you have to own land, or you have to have a certain amount of money, or be from a certain family. Pennsylvania said, as long as you're white and a dude and you pay your taxes, you can vote, right? So again, this is a very democratic system. And that kind of direct democracy, right? That like, I have, let's say there's like 1 million people in Pennsylvania, and that, every 100,000 people gets a representative, so that there's going to be 100 representatives. I'm not good at math. 10 representatives, maybe 10, whatever. So there's gonna be 10 representatives, and every 100,000 people basically gets one, right? And they get to vote on who that representative is, and they're gonna go vote on their behalf. Very simple. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, things are going to get a lot more complicated, right? Instead of having just one unicameral legislature, they're going to have 3 branches of government: an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. So they're going to have a governor. Pennsylvania does not have a governor because that reminded them too much of what happened under the monarchy. They didn't want a governor. But Massachusetts will have a governor. They will have like a court system. They'll have like a Supreme Court and so on and so forth. And they'll have a legislature just like Pennsylvania does, where it's like more representative democracy, but their legislature is going to be a bicameral legislature. There's going to be 2 houses. One of the houses is the upper house, which represents the interest of the elite, and the other house is the lower house, which represents the interest of the commoners. Okay. So already this thing is far more complicated, and there's a lot more kind of like layers to how to get from the voice of the people to the voice of who's actually making the decisions, right? But even further than that, they limit who can vote to people who own land. So you have to own land in order to vote, which restricts the number of voters a lot more than Pennsylvania did. So if you're someone in Massachusetts, you're like, okay, most people can't vote. I mean, that's true in Pennsylvania too, but even most white men can't vote in Massachusetts. And then when we do vote, we vote for representatives in the lower house, the house that represents the commoners. Then there's this elite house, it's the upper house on top of that. So if there's something that we want, we vote for people, and they're going to vote for this thing that we want. But the elites can squash that because they're in an upper house. So even if the lower house approves something, the upper house has to then approve it after that. Then after the upper house approves it, if they don't squash it, the governor has to agree to it as well. So you can see there's multiple layers, a very convoluted, kind of complicated system. There's a lot of good reasons for that. We'll talk about it later on, because for those of you who know a little bit about it, a little bit, know that that is essentially the type of government that we will set up eventually as a nation. But there's good reasons for all of that there. It's just in many ways seem to be less directly democratic than Pennsylvania. Again, you don't need to memorize the details of the Pennsylvania Constitution and the Massachusetts Constitution. You just need to notice, whoa, those are very different systems that reflect very different ideas. And when all of these representatives are going to meet at some sort of a convention to set up a national constitution, the people from Pennsylvania are probably going to want something that looks a lot like what Pennsylvania has, and the people from Massachusetts are probably going to want to look like a lot like what people from Massachusetts have, and add in 11 more states after that. So it's just very complicated. And again, we can't afford to have infighting and complication and tension between the colonies, states, at this very early fragile stage in our country. We really need to kind of all get on the same page very quick, because if we don't start right, things aren't going to go well, right? Okay. So now that we've done all that, we can now go on and start talking about a national government, what that looks like. But before we do that, let's just once again talk about this idea of freedom and this idea of liberty, and how different people have very different ideas about it. Because it would be, criminal might be strong, but it would be, I think we would be doing a bad job if we were to talk about American history and talk about the founding fathers and talk about the founding of this country and talk about the celebration of liberty and the celebration of freedom that comes with our idea of the revolution and our idea of the beginning of our nation. If we did not recognize how much hypocrisy was involved in all of that, right? So when we declared our independence from Great Britain, we were all about liberty and we were all about freedom. We're all about the natural rights of men and we were all about rejecting tyranny and all these other things. But of course, as we know, all of the men who advocated for those things as part of their independence from Great Britain were in turn doing the exact opposite of what they were, calling for when it came to various groups of people within the colonies and within the United States. So the American Revolution, which was about liberty and freedom and natural rights of men and anti-tyranny, didn't do anything to change slavery. Slavery is not going to be touched or changed at all. It will continue to exist. The American Revolution, which was about freedom and liberty and natural rights and rejecting tyranny, did nothing to change the relationship between the Americans and the natives, who are having their land stolen and are kind of under a constant, attack from white people who are moving westward. The American Revolution, which talked about liberty and freedom and natural rights and rejected tyranny, didn't do anything to change the rights of women in the United States. This here is Abigail Adams. This is John Adams' wife. She wrote him a letter when they were creating a new government that specifically said, don't forget about the women. You guys are all about anti-tyranny, and let me be clear, to every woman, the man in their life, their husband or their father, is a tyrant. As long as you don't give us the right to vote, as long as you don't give us the right to own property, as long as you don't give us the right to, et cetera, et cetera. So we could talk all day about freedom and liberty and natural rights, but those things were being rejected and withheld from a lot of other people at the same time, right? These aren't minority groups. Women make up half of the population. Native African Americans make up half of the population in the South. Native Americans, it's a bit of a different thing, but only a very small minority of people. And again, in some places, if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote, right? So only a very small minority of people were actually allowed to enjoy the liberty and the freedom and so on and so forth. Now, let me again reiterate. Going back and just like trashing on the founding fathers and saying they were a bunch of hypocrites is not helpful, and it's not even really honest, right? It's just important that we understand the full broad view of history. So the thing that's important to me to recognize about the founding fathers is they fell dramatically short of living up to the standards that they supposedly espoused, right? And we can see evidence of that right here on this slide. But at the same time, they did truly believe in those things as far as what that meant in their time, in their way of understanding it. And they created a framework and a structure within our government through which subsequent generations down the road could continue to make steps towards those words being true, that all men are created equal, right? So they knew we're not going to be able to actually accomplish these things right here, right now. And some of them didn't want to, and some of them did. But at the very least, they created a framework by which future generations could continue that work. And as we said before, when we talked about loan and lies, my teacher told me, we obviously in our own generation have our work to continue to do in a variety of ways. I still don't think, and you can disagree with me, but I still don't think we've actually lived up to the values that were laid down in the Declaration of Independence, and I think we're still trying to. But you can't talk about this time period without acknowledging that there was some level of hypocrisy, right? The founding fathers, I like to say, were just as hypocritical as they were aspirational. They were hypocrites, but they also aspired to a future in which these things could be true. So you can't talk about this time period without acknowledging this reality and give an honest account of history. The last group on here is the Loyalists. This is the 1/3 of American colonists who stayed loyal to Great Britain during the war. They were not treated well when the war was over. Many of them were harassed. Many of them lost their businesses. Many of them had their businesses or their homes burned down. So a lot, in some cases, the colonists weren't very, they were kind of sore winners. Many Loyalists ended up migrating to Canada because they wanted to kind of stay within the British Empire. So anyway, so important to acknowledge that. But let's move on with our story here. What is the national government actually going to look like? Okay, so a couple things that we should kind of acknowledge right at the beginning. Our first attempt at a national government will not work. It's going to crash and burn. It won't even last a decade. So again, in this incredibly fragile moment, very early on, as we're trying to make things work, things don't look good early on, right? It looks like we're not really succeeding because the first attempt at government that we make, which is known as the Articles of Confederation, will not work. So let's talk about it a little bit and understand why. So, first, let's kind of look at the broader framework here, okay? We want a republic. We want a republic. That's the type of government we want. It's the opposite of a monarchy, right? So even though we have all of these varied opinions from all of these different colonies about exactly what we should do, and there's going to be a lot of disagreement and a lot of negotiation and a lot of fighting and a lot of compromise about all the details, the broad idea of what we want is shared by pretty much everybody. Number one, we do not want monarchy. We don't want it. We had it, didn't like it, got rid of it. We want something different, okay? We need something new, something different, right? So we want to go as far away from that as possible. In a monarchy, the king or the queen holds all of the power and everybody else is their subject. So what's the reverse of that? A republic. In a republic, the power is in the hands of the people. Again, these ideas are ideas that colonists were raised on, right? We talked about the 1700s being kind of a healthy diet of Enlightenment ideas. This comes from the Enlightenment. This was from that John Locke quote we looked at a couple lectures back. That the only reason the people in power have power is because everybody else consents to it. We are the ones that have the power. We get to choose who are the people who are our leaders. So that's what a republic is. So that's fundamental, universally agreed upon by everybody, even as we disagree with all the details of what that actually looks like and how it plays itself out and what the mechanisms are. That fundamental truth is agreed upon by all colonists. We should have a republic. The power is with the people. Who the people is, again, that's a tricky definition because the people aren't women or African Americans or Native Americans, or in often cases even white guys that don't own land. So power to the people is tricky. And also how much power and in what way we give them, all those things are going to be negotiated. But fundamentally, that the people should have the power. So we are a republic. That is the type of government we're going to set up. But we are even more specifically a federalist republic, a federalist republic. So what is federalism? Okay. Federalism is the idea that there are two levels of government. We have the national government and we have state governments, right? And this is again something that is universally agreed upon. We are not going to eliminate all of the states and eliminate all the state governments and just be under one big national government. We will have a national government, but we're also going to maintain all of the state governments that existed and all of the boundaries for all the states that exist. So we're going to have a governing system in which there is a national government and state governments, and the national government will have specific powers and responsibilities, and the state governments will have specific powers and responsibilities. Okay, so that's what we got going on here. That's the general framework. It's a federalist republic. Two levels of government, national and state, and the power rests in the hands of the people. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation are one example of a federalist republic. It's our first attempt, right? This is our first attempt at a federalist republic. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like and what it means. It is described as a firm league of friendship, right? So it's still the 13 states, each kind of independent and autonomous, that will come together from time to time to get things done, right? So I'm going to reuse the analogy that I used last time. Imagine that you live on a street, like a residential neighborhood, right? And there's 13 homes on that street. And not everybody gets along with everybody. Some people really don't like each other. You know, Bill's dog keeps pooping on John's lawn. Sally, listens to music until 3 a.m. and keeps, Susie up. Whatever, they have their problems. But when the city comes and notifies everybody, we want to build a 7-story apartment complex at the end of your street, on the empty lot at the end of your street, everybody on that street is against it because they're like, that's going to impact traffic, whatever. So these 13 different homes all have to come together to stand up against the city who wants to build that apartment complex. So that's basically what the Revolutionary War was. They all came together to oppose the city. We may not like each other, we may not get along, but we have a common cause to stop that apartment complex from being built. And then once that's done, we'll all go back to kind of doing our own thing. Like, we're not like now going to create some neighborhood government that that controls all of us. Like, I'm gonna go back to my house and do my thing, you're gonna go back to your house and do your thing, et cetera, et cetera. And if we ever need to come back together for any issue, we can. And that's essentially what the Articles of Confederation are. It's like, we're all gonna go back to doing our own thing, but at the very least, we have this mechanism where we can come back together to address anything we need to address, right? So how is it organized? First of all, and for those of you who remember from like 4 slides ago, it very much is like the Pennsylvania Constitution. We're going to have a one-house Congress, just one house, not a bicameral legislature, a unicameral legislature, a one-house Congress. Every state will get 1 vote in that Congress. Virginia gets 1 vote, Georgia gets 1 vote, Massachusetts gets 1 vote, New Hampshire gets 1 vote, Maryland gets 1 vote, etc. You get it. Everybody has 1 vote. There is no executive, there's no president. There is no judiciary, there are no courts. Now, whatever anybody wants to do in their own state, that's fine. So Massachusetts can keep its system, Georgia can keep its system, Rhode Island can keep its system. But for the national government, this is how we're doing things, right? Okay, so there's no executive, no president, no judiciary, no Supreme Court. It's just a one-house Congress with 13 members, 1 from each state, each get 1 vote. If you want to do anything, you have to get 9 of the 13 states to vote in favor of it, right? That's a pretty high bar. It's not simple majority. It's not 7 out of 13, it's 9 out of 13. They are limiting the strength of the national government. They want a very weak national government. They want most of the power and most of the rights to stay in the hands of the states. They want to be able to do whatever they want to do. They don't want a national government to have any power over them. They don't want a national government to come down to Virginia and tell Virginia what to do. They don't want a national government to come down and tell New Hampshire what to do. They want to be able to do whatever they want to do in their own spot. So they're making the government very weak and inept, not inept, very weak and I don't know the word, but they're making it very weak on purpose, and they're making it difficult to get anything done, right? That's what I'm trying to get at here. If you want to change the Articles of Confederation themselves, you need all 13 states to agree to that, 13 out of the 13. So if 12 of the 13 states agree and Rhode Island is like, I don't really want to do that, it's not going to happen. And Rhode Island is literally, this is no exaggeration, literally smaller than the nail on my pinky. But if they don't want to do it, it's not happening. You have to have 13 out of the 13 states. So again, they are intentionally making a very weak government that is dramatically limited in what it's able to do. This right here is a list of all of the powers that the government, that the national government has, the federal government. These are all the powers. Not like the list continues on the next slide. This is the whole list. They have the power to declare war. They have the power to make treaties. And they have the power to conduct foreign affairs. Now, you may notice all 3 of those things have something in common. All 3 of those things have to do with external business, things that happen outside of the United States. They don't have any power whatsoever, none, nada, zilch, no power whatsoever on internal domestic issues. The national government has no power whatsoever, no control, no responsibilities over anything that happens inside the United States. The only reason the national government exists is in case we need to deal with things outside the United States, then the 13 states can come together and say, how do we want to deal with this together? If we want to make a treaty, if we want to declare war, any kind of foreign affairs, that's all they do. So their power is incredibly limited. Their power only, you need 9 of the 13 states to agree to something, right? There's no president, no church, and they only have any influence or power over things happening externally outside the United States. So a very, very limited government. All right. What I will tell you right now is it was flawed in its design. Why did the Articles of Confederation fail? It was flawed in its design. We will need a stronger federal government than this to deal with some of the issues that we have. We are a brand new baby country. We are incredibly fragile. We're going to have a lot of issues we have to deal with. And we're going to have a lot of fighting between the states. And we're going to need a federal government to be able to deal with those issues, to have a little bit more power. And so It totally makes sense why they wanted such a weak federal government. They didn't want to put all the hands in the federal government because that looks too much like a monarchy. And they're all still very loyal to the idea that their state is their state, and they don't want to give away any power to some federal government, right? If all 13 houses on my block were like, all right, let's just like create some government that can like tell us what to do because it would be better for us, and now all of a sudden they're telling me like I have to build a pool in my backyard, and they're telling Bill that he has to paint his walls green, and they're telling Sally that her daughter can only have like 2 hours of screen time a day. Like, I don't need my neighborhood watch to start telling me what I need to do in my backyard, right? They only should exist in case there's a 7-story, apartment complex that's coming up. We all have to deal with it. So it makes sense why they don't want to have a strong federal government. Like they're scared of a monarchy again. But the problem is it's a structural flaw. It's a flaw in the design. They are going to need a stronger federal government. So we'll get to that. But first, let's give the Articles of Confederation their due. They do have some achievements. All their achievements have to do with land. And all their achievements have to do with land, the land that exists in between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So remember, everything in between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachians is pretty well settled, pretty well laid out. I got a garbage truck out there. Hopefully it's not too loud. There's a design, everything's figured out, right? We got the 13 colonies, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other side of the Appalachians, that's kind of like a no man's land. Like that's wide open. We don't really know what to do with that, right? So we're going to try to fit. So the Articles of Confederation has basically 3 achievements, 3 things that they achieve, and they all have to deal with what we do with that land. So the first thing they do is determine how the territories out there can eventually become states. So they divide it into a couple of different territories, and they say, okay, once the population of each specific area gets to a certain number, we will let them apply to become a state. And that's kind of a big deal. Not only will they be able to become a state, but they'll be able to become a state that has full equal status. So they could have said, all right, these guys will become states, but they don't get a vote in Congress, or these guys will become states, but they have to X, Y, and Z, whatever. They don't make them like jump through hoops or do anything. Just basically, once they get to a certain population, they can apply for statehood and they'll become a state equal. Boom. Easy. That's the first thing they did. Okay. Not very exciting, but they accomplished something. Good job, Articles of Confederation. That's the Land Ordinance of 1784. The Land Ordinance of 1785 focuses on paying back the war debt to a certain degree. So all of that land out there belongs to who? It doesn't belong to any of the states. All of the states are basically like, their land is on the east side of the Appalachians. So everything from the Appalachians to the Mississippi, who does that belong to? So there's an agreement that all belongs to the national government. The national government owns all of that land. Now they can divide it up into little pieces of property and sell that to people who want to migrate westward. By the way, who does it belong to? The natives. But you know how that goes. Anyway, so it belongs to now we're saying it belongs to the federal government, the national government, and they're going to be able to divide it into, little pieces of property. And as people want to migrate out over the Appalachians into this new land, the federal government can sell that land to people, make money off of that, and pay back the war debt. So that's what the Land Ordinance of 1785 is about. Again, not very exciting. No one's making a movie about this great historical time period, but good job, Articles of Confederation. You accomplished 2 things. The third accomplishment or achievement of the Articles of Confederation is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So the Northwest Territory, which now we would think of as like Oregon and Washington, but then they thought of it as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, because that was the westernmost part of the United States at the time. The Northwest Ordinance, they're going to decide to outlaw slavery in that area. Now, this is a little bit more interesting than the first 2 land ordinances, right? This is kind of a big deal. We know that slavery is going to be a big part of our story. There's going to be a lot of drama around this question of slavery. There already has been, even before we became the United States. Now that we are the United States, it's going to be huge. Like, it's going to lead us into a civil war that almost destroys our country and destroys the lives of over 600,000 Americans. Like, slavery is a big deal. So the fact that early on in American history, under the Articles of Confederation, which proved to be, a kind of a feckless, pointless governing system, still they accomplished a pretty big thing when they said we're going to outlaw slavery in this area. That's a pretty big deal. So that one's more interesting, a little bit more exciting. But that's pretty much it as far as the accomplishments of the as far as the accomplishments of the Articles of Confederation. The problems under the Articles of Confederation is that our economy is in really, really bad shape. Remember, our economy was in really, really bad shape during the war. Just because we won the war doesn't mean our economic problems have gone away. We still owe a ton of money. And we actually probably even know more now than we did during the war. We have a huge war debt. And we also have no national economic policy. We have no way of raising money. We have no way of taxing people. We have no kind of like agreed upon way of just figuring out a monetary system. Every single state has its own economic system. Every single state has its own debt from the war. And every single state is figuring out how to pay back its own debt. Now, some states have already paid back their debts. Some states have monumental debts that haven't been paid back yet. Massachusetts, not surprisingly, has a big debt because that's where most of the fighting happened, right? The southern states, they don't have that big of a debt because there wasn't a lot of fighting down there. So they're able to pay back their debt faster. Massachusetts is like, well, wait a minute, shouldn't we all kind of pitch in to pay back the debt overall because we all got our freedom from the war? So again, not only do we have these big financial economic problems, but these problems are going to lead to fighting between the colonists. So all the colonies are going to have to start all of this infighting and getting after each other about who should pay back debt and so on and so forth. It's like a freaking garbage truck parade out there. Anyway, so this is a problem, and this is a problem that needs a national government to solve. We need to come up with a national economic policy. We need to all agree on one way to go about doing this. We can't have 13 different people trying to figure out how to do this, right? It just doesn't work that way, right? If there was any issue that a group of people were trying to solve, 13 different people, and they were like, okay, we have this big problem, and the whole school needs to be someone graffitied all over the entire campus, and we need to paint over the whole thing. So everybody grab some paint and get going. That's not a good way to figure it out. Have 13 people just randomly go and start painting. Like by the time it's done, some buildings won't have been painted because hey, I thought you were going to do that. Some buildings will be blue instead of whatever color they were supposed to be. We need to come up with a strategy and a plan. We need to have some sort of a system to be able to go about and move forward. And that's the problem here with our economic catastrophe. We do not have a national economic plan. So that's the problem. But there's going to be a specific event that highlights this problem in a way that's going to push everybody to realize that the Articles of Confederation need to be fixed. And that specific event is known as Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion happened in Massachusetts. It was led by a guy named Daniel Shays, not Mr. Shay, the English teacher and the track coach. He's not a violent man. Anyway, Daniel Shays is a farmer in Western Massachusetts, and this is a revolution or a rebellion against the government of Massachusetts by farmers in Western Massachusetts. So what are they so pissed off about? Like, what are they rebelling against? Let me know if this story sounds familiar. So Massachusetts has a big debt, a big old debt from the war. And they're like, dude, we got to pay down this debt. Like you know what I mean? What are we doing? There's not a big national economic policy, so we got to pay it down on our own. So the state of Massachusetts, the government of Massachusetts increases taxes by a factor of 5. You have to pay 5 times more taxes than you did before, right? So you have a government who fought a war, who now has a debt, is going to pay off that debt by taxing people. That story should sound familiar to you, right? And it sounds familiar to the farmers in Western Massachusetts who were like, whoa, wait a second. About 10 years ago, you told us that we needed to fight a revolution against Great Britain. Great Britain was taxing us because they had a war debt that we didn't want to pay back. And so we had a revolution to say, we're not going to do that. And now 10 years later, you're doing the exact same thing that Great Britain did. Sorry, but we're going to have another rebellion because there's no difference here. We didn't want to pay it to London. We don't want to pay it to Boston. We don't want to pay taxes, and we're just not gonna stand for it. So Shays' Rebellion is basically, in their minds, in the minds of the farmers out there, a continuation of the revolution, right? We're just gonna keep doing what we're gonna keep fighting against some oppressive government trying to tax us to pay back this debt. Like, we're not standing for it. So Shays' Rebellion scared the hell out of a lot of people, right? Because again, we are a brand new country, super fragile. there's a lot of opportunities for things to go haywire and the whole thing to fall apart. And then who knows what will happen after that. We need to be moving forward in lockstep together to have any chance of this brand new experiment called the United States of America actually surviving. And if we have, popular rebellion rising up against governments inside the United States, that's not a good look. It's not going to go well, right? So let me just quickly pause the tape right here and rewind it to a different rebellion. These two rebellions have nothing in common other than one big thing that they have in common. So put the pause button on Shays' Rebellion. Let's rewind the tape back to Bacon's Rebellion. You remember Bacon's Rebellion happened in Virginia in the late 1600s. And the cause of Bacon's Rebellion was that a bunch of indentured servants who thought that they were going to be able to get some land when they were done with their contract were pissed off because there's no land left. And the governor wasn't letting them go any further west. So they rise up, they have a rebellion, they rise up against the government, they march on the capital of Virginia, they run the governor out of town, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually the rebellion is put down, blah, 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 blah. Again, not the same situation at all what happens with Shays' Rebellion, except for this. So remember, after Bacon's Rebellion, the ruling class in Virginia and across the South, it scared the bejesus out of them. They were like, whoa, okay, this is getting out of control. There's like a full-on rebellion happening. What are we going to do? And in that moment, they realize the system that they currently have in place is no longer sustainable. Indentured servitude can no longer work. It's just not going to work anymore. We have to get rid of it and we have to replace it with something else. And of course, they chose kidnapping people from Africa and forcing them into slavery, right? But the point is, there was a mass movement, a popular movement, a rebellion that scared the bejesus out of the ruling class, that made them realize suddenly that the existing structure no longer works and we have to replace it with something else. Okay, now fast forward back to Shays' Rebellion, it's the same thing. There is a mass movement, a popular movement, an uprising, a rebellion. It's going to scare the bejesus out of the ruling class. They're going to realize, man, the existing system and the existing structure that we currently have, in this case, the Articles of Confederation with an incredibly weak federal government, it's not working. And we got to do something about it. So it's this moment, it's this flashpoint moment that kind of represents a bigger thing. Is it Shays' Rebellion specifically that causes people to realize the Articles of Confederation isn't working? No, it's the crumbling economy. But Shays' Rebellion is the flashpoint that really brings that, focuses everybody's attention on it kind of immediately. And so all of the rich and powerful and high status men from the 13 colonies all decide we need to come back together to revise the Articles of Confederation. We need to come back together to make some changes to the Articles of Confederation. Like maybe that was a rough draft, we need to kind of fix it up and do a final draft. That was what they were supposed to do. That was their task. Fix the Articles of Confederation because this isn't working. We need to make some adjustments. What they end up doing is something completely different. They did not do the assignment that they were given. They threw that out and started from scratch and created something completely different. And that's going to be the Constitution. So part 4 is going to focus on the Constitution, but I'm going to do that in a different video. So that video is basically part 3. I'll do a separate video for part 4. So if you've already seen part 3 and you're not interested in watching that, I don't know why you made it to the end of this video, but you didn't have to have watched it. For those of you who need part 3 and part 4, as soon as you're done with this one, go get a snack, whatever, come back and watch part 4. So I'll see you over on the other video.